In the 1930s, a thriving community of river people lived along the lower White River in the Arkansas Delta. Considered outcasts by drylanders, river people had an agreed-upon way of life. They shared what they had within the community, and there was an understanding. Anyone who stole from their neighbor or took a life would face river justice. In 1931, 18-year-old Helen Spence was featured on the front page of the New York Times. She made national news after she sought vengeance for the death of her father and stepmother. Helen, who was born on a houseboat on the White River, was quoted in a national paper explaining her way of life, saying, "Down where I was raised in the White River bottoms, where we rarely saw the law, we took care of such matters ourselves. No one ever killed anyone unless there was a reason for it. I was born to that kind of law, and it seemed all right to me." Over the next 3 years, the media followed Helen's trial, her imprisonment, another murder charge, prison escapes, and the murder of Helen Spence at the age of 22. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring history and mysteries of the American South. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is the story of Arkansas Delta folk hero, Helen Spence. The White River flows for over 700 miles from its headwaters in the Ozarks on down to the mighty Mississippi River. St. Charles, a small town in Arkansas County, is located on a bluff over the lower White River. Settled in the early 19th century, there were people who lived on land and people who chose to live on shanty boats. For generations, this culture thrived. Living on homemade houseboats was an affordable option for people in rural areas, especially during the Great Depression, when work was hard to find. River people were able to create their own place to live, free of charge, on the river that sustained life. River people were branded as vagabonds and misfits by drylanders, and as the community grew, they created an independent existence on the White River. Law enforcement avoided river people and knew they had their own way of handling things when they were wronged. Anyone who stole from or hurt someone on the river knew they would face their victim or their family. This river justice was honored and accepted within the culture. This was well known in the Arkansas Delta and neighboring regions, but the country was introduced to river justice in 1931, when Helen Spence became a household name and the subject of great debate. Some called her an outlaw, and some considered her a hero. Helen Ruth Spence was the second daughter, born to Wilburn Cicero and Ellen Spence. Helen was born on the family houseboat on the lower White River on February 23, 1912. Just a few years later, Ellen died. Within a year, Helen's father, who preferred to be called Cicero, married Jane Elam. The couple soon welcomed their first child, a daughter named Eva. In 1920, Cicero, his wife, and children were living with family in Monroe County, Arkansas. Cicero worked as a timber cutter. Helen was a bright little girl who was very close to her father. She spent a lot of her time following her father as he hunted and fished the river and learned the skills needed to thrive. Helen was fiercely protective of her father and her older sister Edie. Around 1921, Cicero's marriage to Jane ended. Years later, he married his third wife, Ada, and by 1930 had settled back into life on the White River in Arkansas County. Helen, who was a dark-haired, petite beauty, was now 17 years old and getting a lot of attention from men. She stood out in her community because of her fashionable clothes. She was a talented seamstress, and she was very outgoing. On January 21st, 1930, Helen married a moonshiner named Buster Eaton. The marriage was a surprise to a lot of people who didn't exactly see the pair being the right fit. Helen was 17, and Buster was 29. Buster had cut timber with Cicero Spence and was liked by the family. Perhaps that's why Cicero didn't stir up trouble, considering their marriage was illegal. Under Arkansas law, Helen had to be 18 when she married, but she lied about her age on the marriage certificate. The marriage did not last. Helen dropped the Eaton name and returned to her father's houseboat. Helen's marriage may have been motivated by a need to seek protection and time away from her father. In 1929, Cicero Spence was accused of murdering Jed Wilsey, a fellow river dweller and timber watcher south of St. Charles. An argument between the men turned violent, and Jed was killed. Cicero was charged with second-degree murder, convicted, and sentenced to 9 years. He appealed and was granted bond while he awaited the Supreme Court ruling on his sentence. 2 river dwellers, Jack Wuerls and Jess Nixon, believed the Drylanders' justice had not been severe enough. We'll never know how they managed to do it, but on April 30th, 1930, Wuerls and Nixon lured Cicero and Ada Spence out on the White River in a speedboat. They were drinking, and things seemed fine until they got to a remote area known as Cowpen Bend. Jack Wuerls and Cicero Spence argued. Wuerls shot an unarmed Cicero and became frustrated that Cicero did not immediately die. Ada Spence watched in horror as Wuerls threw Cicero into the river to finish him off. Wuerls and Nixon took Ada to the riverbanks, where they repeatedly assaulted her throughout the night. The next morning, they returned her to the area near the Spence houseboat, threw her into the river, and fled. Police heard there had been an attack of some kind at Cowpen Bend, but due to the remote location, it took them 3 days to get there and look into the incident. They found Ada Spence in a critical state. She was able to tell most of what happened and name the attackers. Jess Nixon and Jack Wuerls were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Wuerls confessed to shooting Cicero Spence, but claimed it was self-defense. Helen Spence was devastated by the loss of her father. Friends later said that when news reached Helen that her father had been killed, she immediately said life was not worth living anymore. 2 weeks later, Ada Spence was hospitalized in Memphis and faced another surgery to treat injuries sustained during the attack. Ada Spence died during surgery. With both of their parents gone, Helen realized staying on the family houseboat with her sister was not the best idea. She feared someone may try to finish off her family. She and her sister moved to nearby DeWitt, where Helen went to work as a waitress at the Powell Cafe. There had been an ongoing search for the body of Cicero Spence. In early June, Cicero's body was recovered near the area where Ada told police Jack Wuerls shot him and threw him overboard. Helen Spence was overwhelmed that November when the cafe had to lay off several employees due to financial struggles. Unemployment and grief took its toll on Helen. On Christmas Eve, she walked up to the cigar counter at the Powell Cafe and attempted to take her own life by shooting herself. She was rushed to a nearby hospital where she was treated and survived. The nurses who cared for her said she was one of the most lovable patients they had ever attended. As she healed, she mentioned Jack Wuerls' trial in January. Her goal was to be there, to sit in the courtroom and make sure justice was served for her family. When the trial began on January 19th, 1931, Helen, fashionably dressed in one of her homemade dresses, walked into the courtroom and sat directly behind Jack Wuerls. The prosecuting attorney was visibly shocked when the judge ruled Ada Spence's statement would be barred. In her statement to police, Ada named Jack Wuerls as the man who shot Cicero, along with naming Jess Nixon, who helped with the attack. Helen Spence took note when fellow spectators began to whisper that without that statement, Jack Wuerls would probably be acquitted. Later in the day, Helen Spence noticed Jack Wuerls looked very confident as he sat at the defense table. Helen was determined justice would be served. As the jury stood and prepared to leave the courtroom for deliberation, Helen Spence calmly stood, moved to the defense table, drew a .45 caliber pistol from her coat pocket, and shot Jack Wuerls 4 times. As panic erupted in the courtroom and people fled, Helen, who saw Wuerls was dead, remained calm and said aloud, "He killed my daddy." As everyone else started to run for an exit, the judge moved toward Helen and held her until officers arrived to take her into custody. Helen looked up at the judge and said, "I was afraid that jury was going to free him." Helen Spence became a household name as national papers covered the story of this pretty teenage girl who calmly shot and killed Jack Wuerls to avenge her father and stepmother's deaths. As news spread of the way of life of the river people, the public was sympathetic and demanded leniency for the young girl. Helen stood trial for the murder of Jack Wuerls in October 1932. There was no doubt she had shot him, but at the advice of counsel, Helen pled not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Helen's older sister and her paternal grandmother testified to Helen's fragile mental state in the weeks and months following the death of Cicero and Ada. Being forced to move from the houseboat into DeWitt, then losing her job, it all just seemed too much to bear. 23 witnesses testified to Helen being driven insane by her grief. Dr. L.R. Brown of the state hospital observed Helen, learned of her family background, and agreed. Helen Spence was insane at the time she shot and killed Jack Wuerls. The state maintained Helen knew right from wrong when she intentionally entered the courtroom with a gun and shot Jack Wuerls. During deliberation, the jury was split over what to do. They asked the judge if there was a way to reduce charges to manslaughter. The judge said they could only find her guilty or not guilty of murder in the first or second degree. Helen Spence was convicted of second-degree murder and released on $1,000 bond pending appeal of her sentence. This was Helen's second release on bond in 1932. Earlier in the year, while she was out on bond awaiting trial for the murder of Jack Wuerls, she took a job at the White House lunchroom in DeWitt. The owner, Jim Bohatz, had a questionable reputation in town, especially when it came to women. Helen was frustrated by Bohatz's constant unwanted advances. She made it clear she wasn't interested. When he threatened to hurt her, Helen quit. In February 1932, Bohatz's body was discovered at a well-known trysting spot near DeWitt. He had been shot to death with his own gun. There were questions as to whether Helen Spence murdered him, but ultimately, the detectives agreed. The evidence ruled out Helen as the killer. Now, late in the year, Helen received good news when her conviction for the Wuerls murder was reversed. Granted a new trial, she was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 2 years with 9 months credit for time served. Due to the public outcry of sympathy and support for Helen, she was paroled on June 10, 1933. 1 month after Helen was paroled, she was living in Little Rock under an assumed name when she walked into the Little Rock police station, asked to speak with a detective, and confessed to the murder of Jim Bohatz. She told the detective Bohatz had worn her down. She finally agreed to meet him after work. When they arrived at the trysting spot, he tried to assault her, so she shot and killed him with his own gun. This was a shocking confession from Helen Spence, who had been cleared of Bohatz's murder. But it seems the conditions of Helen's parole were so unbearable, she preferred confessing to a murder she did not commit over her current conditions. According to Helen's parole records, a wealthy landowner named W.B. Graham signed a parole document and paid $4,000 for Helen Spence's parole. This practice, known as debt peonage, was a common occurrence in the area around Arkansas's women's prison. Farmers and landowners could buy the debt of a female prisoner and in turn acquired what these men jokingly called their concubines. It was abuse and assault of countless female prisoners, including Helen Spence. Rather than endure these conditions, she escaped the Graham property, fled to the Little Rock police station, and confessed to murder. Helen was tried and convicted for the second-degree murder of Jack Bohatz and sentenced to 10 years at the State Farm for Women in Jacksonville. Helen's attempt to escape the abuse of Graham unknowingly sent her straight into a more difficult situation at the prison farm, where the matron sent prisoners on trips to Memphis, where they were forced into prostitution. Helen attempted several escapes during these trips. She used her sewing skills to sew checkered napkins from the prison cafeteria inside her prison uniform. On one of those trips to Memphis, she asked to use the bathroom, turned her uniform inside out, and walked away from the rendezvous area unnoticed. But she was quickly recaptured. Helen attempted to escape at least 3 times between September to November 1933. Each time, she was quickly recaptured, then whipped with a leather strap prison guards called the Black Snake. This method of punishment involved a naked prisoner being placed over a wooden barrel to be whipped. When she had free time in her cell, Helen would write poetry and detective stories. She often submitted her stories to magazines. Despite numerous rejections, prison authorities were worried she would disclose what was happening behind bars in those detective stories. In what's believed to have been a warning to Helen, she was ordered to the state mental hospital for observation. While there, a defiant Helen decided to write down every detail of the abuse she and her fellow inmates experienced. She submitted it to a magazine, but once again received a rejection slip in the mail. Following a month of observation, doctors said Helen was sane, and she was returned to the prison farm. Helen Spence's return to the prison was met with disdain by the matron, who ordered Helen be put in a cage-like cell, specially constructed for her. A determined Helen Spence vowed she would escape again. And she did, one last time. On July 10, 1934, Helen was working with a crew in a strawberry patch. She told one of the guards she was sick and was granted permission to visit the infirmary for medication. The details of what unfolded next vary. It all depends on the account you're inclined to believe. Newspapers reported that Helen and her fellow prisoners had been dressed in men's overalls while working in the strawberry patch. Helen, with her hair cut short and wearing men's clothing, was said to have slipped into the cell of a male prisoner, Frank Martin. As a prison trustee, the convicted murderer was allowed to have a pistol inside and was granted more privileges by the warden. Helen allegedly stole Frank's pistol and snuck away from the farm. V.O. Brockman, the assistant prison superintendent, along with the prison trustee, Frank Martin, were ordered to search for Helen. They found her walking down Tadpole Road, not far from the prison grounds. Frank Martin claimed he cried out and ordered Helen to stop. When she ran, Frank said he saw her reach for her pistol in the waistband of her pants. Frank quickly lifted the shotgun he was carrying and said he had no choice but to shoot to kill Helen Spence. He shot 22-year-old Helen behind the ear, killing her instantly. National papers printed headlines about the well-known woman from Arkansas being killed. These stories featured photos of the body of Helen Spence on the dirt road where she died. Photos that raised suspicions about the death scene. There were accusations that the photos were staged by Brockman or Martin. In one photo, there was a pistol in Helen's waistband, just as Frank Martin described. In another, the pistol was stuffed in her bra. The position of Helen's hands also raised questions. In one photo, Helen's hands covered her face, while another showed her hands away from her face. When the public learned Frank Martin, a convicted killer, had fired the shot that killed Helen, the media and the public demanded an inquiry into the Arkansas penal system. The trustee system, using fellow prisoners to guard others within the prison, was revealed to be a system designed to fail. The superintendent of the Arkansas penal system, A.G. Stedman, confirmed there were 14 incidents of prison trustees shooting and killing fellow prisoners during his term alone. Stedman was forced to resign due to the fallout from the murder of Helen Spence. A new superintendent of the state penal system ordered the warden of the women's farm at Jacksonville removed and ordered the end of the trustee practice. V.O. Brockman was suspected of aiding Helen's escape in order to kill and silence Helen. Brockman was charged with accessory to murder. At trial, his defense attempted to prove Helen was so bent on escaping that she would have killed to get away and must have stolen Frank Martin's gun. They pointed to a rejection slip Helen received from one of those detective magazines. Helen had allegedly written a note on the back of her most recent rejection, just days before her death. The note read, "I will never be taken alive." Helen's sister provided the state with stacks of letters and poetry written by Helen to prove the handwriting on the rejection slip did not match her sister's handwriting. The state claimed that note was fake, and along with the suspicious crime scene photos, called into question whether Helen even had a gun when she was killed. In September 1934, the state suddenly announced no charges would be brought against V.O. Brockman unless further evidence was presented. Days later, Frank Martin stood trial for the murder of Helen Spence, but he too was acquitted. He was later paroled. Many believe the rumor that Frank Martin was promised parole if he kept his end of the deal to get rid of troublemaking Helen Spence. A common practice in these sensational crime stories of the 1920s and 30s was to publicly display the bodies of those involved in the story when they met their end. The body of Helen Spence was publicly displayed at a funeral home in North Little Rock. When this was made known to the river people along the lower White River, they traveled to the funeral home, broke in under cover of darkness, and stole Helen's body to ensure she had the dignity of a proper burial. They buried Helen in the Potter's Field in the St. Charles Cemetery. The exact location of her burial was marked only with a cedar tree to ensure only those Helen knew and trusted in life would know her final resting place. That secret was kept by a close childhood friend of Helen's for decades. The location of her burial was revealed after his death, and a headstone now marks the grave of Arkansas folk hero Helen Spence. Helen and an unknown number of women like her were trapped in a cycle of abuse behind prison walls in 1930s Arkansas. The only freedom granted Helen was in those quiet moments she was allowed to write her stories and poetry. She dreamed of her days on the White River bottoms before life took such a tragic turn. From inside a cage specially made for her at the prison farm, she wrote a poem she called Echoes, which paints a picture of a woman dreaming of the what-ifs and perhaps freedom and a fresh start. Echoes reads in part, "Now this is the secret ambition of mine. It's merely to occupy some of the time. You can't heal the heart with no work for the hand, so I pick up my pencil and do what I can. So here by my window, I dream of it all, when shadows like these come and play on the wall. And out of the wreckage, I'm forced to confess, I might build again, and perhaps for the best." There's one final twist in the story of Helen Spence. Following Frank Martin's parole, he took to bragging about being the man who killed Helen Spence. This was a very different version of the convicted killer who had taken the stand at his trial in 1934 and through tears cried out that he hated what he had to do on that dirt road. But it was either kill or be killed by Helen. Years later, Frank Martin decided it would be a good idea to return to DeWitt, Arkansas. By this time, everything Helen endured in that prison and how she died had made Helen a folk hero. Her death, while tragic and in the opinion of the majority of locals, a cold-blooded murder, sparked the beginning of much-needed prison reforms in Arkansas. Considering the highly charged emotions around the subject of Helen Spence, it was surprising that Frank Martin would be so bold as to walk into a local grocery store in DeWitt and start bragging about who he was. Legend says, while he was in the store, he asked a woman for a specific loaf of bread. She said she could do him one better, sold him a loaf that was comparable, but was a lot cheaper, a really great deal. Frank Martin left the store and headed home to make dinner, a meal that included the bread he purchased that day. Frank Martin died in his home that night, and locals vowed he was taken by river justice. Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. If you want to read more about the life of Helen Spence, I'd encourage you to read Daughter of the White River, Depression-Era Treachery by Denise White Parkinson. Like Helen, Denise was born and raised on the banks of the White River. The year after Helen Spence died, Congress passed an act which made the Lower White River a national wildlife refuge. River people were told to move their houseboats, or they would be forcibly removed from the area. River dwellers were granted permission to stay in specific areas, but more and more became dry landers, and the culture began to decline. But it hasn't disappeared. It's a lesser-known part of the history of America that's the focus of an artist named Wes Modes. Years ago, he launched the Secret History of American River People project. He travels down rivers across the country on a rustic shanty boat based on designs from the 1940s. He engages in dialogue and interviews people in river communities to record oral histories and ensure the history of river dwellers is preserved. I'll drop a link to his project, along with a link to Denise White Richardson's book, in the full show notes with all of the sources for this episode at southernmysteries.com. If you enjoy this independent podcast, I hope you'll hit follow where you're listening now so you'll get new episodes in your feed whenever they're available. And make sure you rate and review Southern Mysteries to help encourage other folks to check it out. If you're interested in more stories and a deeper dive into American mysteries, there's lots of bonus content that's available only to patrons of this podcast on our Patreon. It's my thanks to you for supporting this show. You can learn about joining and start listening when you become a member at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. And that might come in handy to have access to those episodes while I take a summer break from this podcast. I'll be working on another project over the next month, which I'll tell you all about in July when we're back with new episodes of Southern Mysteries. Until then, as always, thanks so much for listening.